Thank you. It's nice to be back amongst so many friends. I have one quick announcement. I received an email today from Robert Kearns. Robert went to school with my daughters many years ago, and a great young man, and he's been very active in local history and local environmental issues. And he sent me an email today. He's working on a project for the Leventhal Center at the Boston Public Library, and they're trying to raise funds to digitize old maps of Braintree, Weymouth, and Quincy. And ironically, those are the three things I'm going to talk about tonight. So we've got tremendous maps. Apparently, it's very labor intensive to digitize these, and researchers have been asking about them for years. So apparently, I didn't know this is how it was done, but they have these fundraisers for different projects. If you raise the funds, they hire someone to work exclusively on that. But it's the Leventhal Center at the Boston Public Library. If you're interested in participating in that, it's called atlasscope.tool. And Robert Kearns is the young man who forwarded that information. But it's a Leventhal Map and Education Center. They try to make these things available to researchers. They do great work at the BPL, Boston Public Library, and thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me here this evening. Tonight's topic is a topic that I enjoy speaking on, John Adams and Abigail Adams, two of the most important figures in early American history. I mean, how lucky we are to have such a special connection to both of them. John Adams, of course, was born not too far from here, right down the street at the foot of Penn's Hill back in October 1735. 1735, he was born. The house in which he was born is now located in Quincy, of course, but at the time, it was part of Braintree. In fact, as we all know, we have his birth record about 100 yards behind me inside the Braintree Town Hall, the original document that records his birth and the birth of John Hancock on the same page. We have them right across the street here. I also want to talk about Abigail Adams. This is Women's History Month, and I think it's only fitting that we talk about Abigail, one of the most influential women in American history. She was ahead of her time in a way that I don't think we appreciate enough. So I'll be talking about them both. I'll talk about John's early legal career here in Braintree. This is when he was mostly connected to us. And he really is one of ours. He's a Braintree boy. He spent a lot of time in all sections of Braintree. This section of Braintree was referred to as Manatequit, anything near the Manatequit River. He spent a lot of time here. As we all know, the Braintree Instructions, which he helped draft, was written in what is now the Congregational Church. I believe this is the fifth structure on that site, but he would attend services there back in the 1750s and into the 1760s. But I do want to talk about both of them. John Adams, we all know, and we've all heard the stories of him. What I love, in the last 20 or 30 years, historians have finally come to give him the attention he deserves. There are no statues in Washington on John Adams. There's a Jefferson Memorial, the Washington Memorial, the Franklin Roosevelt Memorial. There are many different memorials. Nothing to John Adams. Yet he was such an influential figure. Thomas Jefferson referred to him as the Colossus of independence. He was a force of nature at the Continental Congress. He was persistent. He was always talking, always encouraging, always focusing on the issues of the time. He did not let up. And I think that's why Thomas Jefferson, who was very quiet, very subdued, always sitting in the background, listening, he marveled at John Adams' ability to talk. This boy from Braintree went and made a huge difference when he did attend the Continental Congress. But Abigail, again, incredibly significant in her own right. It's impossible to talk without John Adams and his accomplishments without talking about Abigail. I don't think he ever would have come close to accomplishing what he did without her. The reason I'm going to recount a few of his early experiences in Braintree before he met her, I think it illustrates how he changed after he met her. He needed someone like her to call him out and to challenge him. She was not afraid to speak her mind. So I think that was incredibly important. And to his credit, he was strong enough and confident enough in his own self that that didn't bother him at all. Having a strong woman as his partner made complete sense to him. And I believe he deserves credit for that. But the two of them, as a pair, were a tremendous partnership. And the amazing thing is that they spent so many years apart. They were married in 1764, when he would travel down to Philadelphia once the Troubles started, First Continental Congress and the Second Continental Congress. Eventually the war would start, and he went off to Europe to try to seek recognition from the French, to seek loans from the Dutch. He spent years over there, came back briefly, wrote the Massachusetts Constitution, went back to Europe, took his son with him, 10-year-old boy. Young John Quincy Adams would leave, a 9-year-old boy, and he would be away from his mother for the next 9 years. When she met him, she just broke into tears. He was a man, a very deep voice, very tall. She said, the only thing I recognized were his eyes. That was it. But imagine being separated that much from your husband, and in this case, her son, and later her second son went over as well. I guess one of the positive things about the two of them being apart so much is that they wrote a lot of letters to each other. She wrote to him when he was in Philadelphia. He wrote to her. And they kept their letters. That's the important thing. So many people have destroyed their letters. Martha Washington destroyed all of George Washington's letters. We don't know why. Again, we never do know why people do those things. Thomas Jefferson's letters were all destroyed. Those are priceless. The wonderful thing about letters is that words never die. They're always with us, centuries, generations later. Abraham Lincoln is very much alive today when you read what he wrote, a brilliant writer. You almost feel as though you're in the room with him. Same thing with Abigail and John. You read their letters, it's as though they're alive today. A famous historian, in fact, the historian who brought John Adams to life again was David McCullough. I'm sure many of you have listened to Dave McCullough speak. A wonderful historian, lived in Hingham for many years. Many years ago, I was on the committee. We were commemorating the anniversary of the First Congregational Church. I think it was 400 years. And we were lucky enough to get McCullough to come and speak at the program. And he was wonderful. He stayed, gave a wonderful talk. When it was over, he stayed in the room and met with everyone. He signed every book. He waited until everyone left, and his daughter came and picked him up. He was out talking with us. He said all I want to do was see the birth records. We brought them over, and he just marveled at it. Wonderful historian. When I was writing my dissertation a long time ago, I was at the Mass Historical, and sitting next to me, the table right next to me, was David McCullough doing research, probably on John Adams. And he mentioned in one of his interviews that it was the greatest time, professional time of his life when he was doing research on Abigail and John Adams because of the letters. He said, I was going to write a book on Jefferson and Adams, but then I started reading these letters. And I became immersed in them. He said I couldn't give it up. He said I was very sad when it ended, when the correspondence stopped. And he made a comment. He said it was a privilege to keep company with these people. That's what history's about. Keeping company with these people. That's what he was doing when he was reading those letters. That's why he fell in love with this subject, this topic. And it's a brilliant book, and it really does bring those letters to life. It brings those two incredible people to life. They were far from perfect. That's one thing we all know. None of us are perfect, and neither were John and Abigail Adams. They had their faults. I mentioned a few of them with John. He was often perceived as vain and pompous, and he could be self-righteous. And Abigail did not hesitate to point those out, and she acknowledged her faults as well. And we'll talk about those. And what I'd like to do tonight is keep this very informal. There are a lot of notes that I have, but beyond that, I want to try to open it up as we're going along. So if I'm talking about something and you've got a question, just raise your hand. We'll talk about it, because I do it in the classroom a lot, and I love it. And I always encourage my students to speak up and ask. I say, if you've got a question, I guarantee you 10 other people in the room have the exact same question. And that way it's a little bit of a discussion. And my guess is that some of you know more about Abigail in some respects than I do. So if you have any comments or suggestions or opinions, by all means, let's talk about them. Same thing with John, but I do want to give some historical background before we jump into the type of people they were. Again, John was born in 1735, right down the street, foot of Penn's Hill. Not a wealthy family by any stretch. His dad was a farmer. He was a deacon at church, member of the militia, incredibly hardworking individual. We know that they owned the property at the foot of Penn's Hill. His father was very active in town events over several years. And John Adams took his love of public service from his father. His father always encouraged him to be involved in public service. We know that later, he had two brothers, John did. He attended Harvard, graduated in 1755, and incredibly, that was the first year he started keeping a diary. One of the great things about the Mass Historical Society is they've got this incredible collection of letters from the entire Adams family. John, Abigail, the sons, the grandsons, the great-granddaughters and great-grandsons, they kept diaries. They recorded everything. And that's what's wonderful about this time period. They were encouraged to record their thoughts, including Abigail. She said, I liked to think about what I was thinking, and I like to write about it and share those thoughts with others. And she kept everything, which is remarkable and very helpful. And I'm always, it's somewhat sad when I look back at how many different groups of people never kept records. My mom's here tonight. Most of our family members came from Ireland. Those families never kept diaries. And one of the reasons, it was stated later, is that many of these people, many were poor, they never felt as though their life was worth writing about. They didn't think it was necessary to record those type of things, that maybe perhaps nothing was noteworthy, which is the furthest thing from the truth. Everyone has a story to tell. Here in the United States, diary keeping was encouraged. John Adams and Abigail Adams were products of the Enlightenment. They were born at the perfect time. America was born at the perfect time, the ideal time. So many ideas and thoughts were coming into place. Montesquieu and this idea of separation of powers with John Locke and all of these political ideals. It would be difficult to create or enact a government based on separation of powers in Europe. The old world was old, very traditional. America was new. And for the Americans who were living here, British subjects, to be sure, but they had a very different way of living. They were used to the idea of freedom. They were used to making decisions for themselves. They were used to passing laws for themselves and deciding what money was going to be spent on. Very thrifty, very careful with the public purse. And they grew up with that sensibility. And it was only when that was challenged by the mother country that they pushed back. And interestingly enough, John Adams was a young attorney when all of this started to happen. And his young bride, Abigail, was there as well. And she would often advise him. That's something we often forget as well. But again, I just want to talk about John Adams for just a second in his early days. After he graduated from Harvard, he went to Worcester for a time. He was a school teacher. Then he decided to settle on the law, and he began practicing in Worcester for a short time. He was there for 2 years, and then he came back in 1757. He returned to Braintree and was admitted to the bar in 1758. There were two topics that interested John Adams when he was a young attorney. And I mentioned these two topics several years ago when I gave a talk. We were talking about John Adams and his experience in Braintree. Roads and taverns. Those were the two things that bothered him the most. The roads were terrible. They drove him crazy, as they do us. The roads in Braintree have not changed very much over the years. But apparently, he always went to town meeting, and he described how town meeting was always divided into two groups. One group wanted to do this, one group wanted to do that. Again, things really don't change very much. He was with the Young Turks. They were looking for change. They're looking for reform. He never quite fit in with the older group, the group led by the Thayers. And we'll talk about Thayer in just a few moments, Ebenezer Thayer in particular, who was the state representative from Braintree. He served in the general court for years and years and years. And I think that always bothered Adams. As Adams was getting older, he was frustrated that young people weren't given the chance to perhaps go to the general court and serve Braintree. Ebenezer Thayer kept that post forever. The only time John Adams ever served in the general court, the state legislature, is when he and Abigail had moved to Boston, and the city of Boston appointed him or elected him to the general court. It wasn't from Braintree. In Braintree, he was a selectman, and he was very active in town meeting, and he served on many different committees. But one of them was on the roads. I just want to mention that for just a second. He was complaining, again, a very young man. He had just been admitted into the bar, and one of the leaders in town, Sam Niles, had been pushing for years to get a tax passed to focus exclusively on the roads, but it never passed. John Adams made it a point to get involved in this issue. He and his friends got involved in this issue. They would help Samuel Niles get this thing through town meeting at long last. Sure enough, he talked about this in his memoirs as an old man. He remembered it, he kept the notes, and he talked about it. And it still bothered him decades later. He said, "The roads were very bad, much neglected, and I thought a tax a more equitable method and more likely to be effectual, and therefore joined this party with Niles and others." And he gave a public speech. And he was very proud about this speech that he gave at Braintree Town Meeting way back then. And he said, "And we carried the day. They carried the vote by a large majority. And he was appointed." They probably said, "Okay, wise guy, now that you get this done, you come up with the details." So they appointed him to the committee to come up with the language of the law itself. And he got a copy from Weymouth, right down the street. He said, "Well, why reinvent the wheel? I'll just borrow what they've done in Weymouth. They look like they've done a pretty good job. I'll just borrow that language." We still do that today. And sure enough, that was used. He reported it back to Town Hall. It was adopted by a great majority of town meeting members. So he was very proud. That was his first public act, his first public speech. So when you think about it, this man who was involved in so much, Continental Congress, ambassador to Britain, emissary to Paris, signer, or one of the writers of the Declaration of Independence, Vice President of the United States, President of the United States, all of the things he did over many years, drafter of the Massachusetts Constitution, which served as a model for other state constitutions, and which served as a model for the United States Constitution. And he also wrote several books and pamphlets on constitutions. The fact that the first public issue that he was ever involved in was repairing the streets of Braintree, I just think is wonderful. The other issue was taverns. He thought they were inappropriate, that there were too many. He had counted the number of taverns in Milton and the number of taverns in Weymouth and a few other towns, and he said, "Braintree has the most." It didn't make sense to him. And he said, "Few things, I believe, have deviated so far from the first design of their institution, are so fruitful of destructive evils, or so needful of a speedy regulation as licensed houses. The accommodation of strangers and perhaps town inhabitants on public occasions are the only warrantable intention of a tavern, and the supply of the neighborhood with necessary liquors in small quantities at the cheapest rates are the only excusable designs of a retailer. And that these purposes may be effected, it's necessary that only the most virtuous and wealthy people are provided with this trust." What he then did is he started mapping out every tavern in town and reported that to town meeting. And at the very center of this map that he designed was the house of Ebenezer Thayer, which suggests that Thayer was always at the center of his thinking. Thayer represented that other party in town, the group that was in charge, the group that was constantly standing in the way of these other young men. And Thayer was very successful. State representative, very active. He owned a few taverns, and one of them was right in the center of town, not too far from where the First Congregational Church is now. And Adams thought that it was also wrong of Ebenezer Thayer to dabble in law. It drove lawyers crazy when others dabbled in the law. You didn't necessarily need a license to practice, and it drove Adams crazy. He mentioned in his diary, he disliked him on two counts. Number one, he kept the taverns, which he thought was wrong. And he added that Thayer was the only representative to the general court over a long period of time, and I'm sure that bothered him as well. But he also mentioned that he was involved in legal matters, which he never should have done. My favorite passage from Adams, and I'll leave it at this, on the subject, May 30th, 1760, speaking of taverns, Here the time, the money, the health, and the modesty of most that are young and many who are old are wasted. Here diseases, vicious habits, bastards, and legislators are frequently begotten. The legislator talking again about Ebenezer Thayer. And he talked about it in his diary. At one point in 1761, that's when he drew the map. That's when he talked about it at a town meeting. And he referred to Thayer as a pettifogging dabbler, a non-professional lawyer. And in one diary entry, he made a comment, and this comes across badly, I think. He berated this man who came to him for help. This is what he said. So he could be harsh. In one diary entry, he describes how he said it in his diary, he berated Thomas Hollis, who apparently had run into tough times with creditors. Hollis went to Adams for legal help, and Adams did help, but only after giving him a long lecture. Adams noted in his diary that the reason Hollis was in such bad financial shape was because he was dabbling in the law, of which he knew nothing, he said. He told him he should have stuck with shoemaking. A tough guy. So Adams could be haughty, pompous, and self-righteous, and vain was often a word that was used to describe him, particularly in these early years. This is when he met Abigail Adams. So John Adams at this point was about 24 years old in 1759 when he first saw Abigail. John Adams' good friend, his name was Richard Cranch. Richard Cranch was dating Mary Smith, who was Abigail's older sister. And they all lived at the parsonage in Weymouth. That's where Abigail was born. She had two sisters, Mary and Elizabeth. One brother, William, they called him Billy. He was the center of the family's attention. It was always the boy, right? It was always the boy. And he received the education none of the girls did. And ironically, it turns out that they had more skills than poor Billy did. Billy had a tough life. He turned to alcohol at a very young age, abandoned his family. They lost all track of him for many years. A very sad story, but he was the one who received the education. Abigail and Mary and Betsy, they called Elizabeth, did not. But it doesn't mean they weren't educated. They educated themselves. They read a great deal. Abigail was very fortunate for a couple of reasons. Her father was a pastor at the North Parish Congregational Church in Weymouth. He was the pastor there for decades. He had a large library. In the Abigail Adams house, which is still around, that's what the Abigail Adams Historical Society, that's our job. Our sole job is to take care of that house, the old parsonage, where Abigail Adams was born and where she spent a lot of time. It's where she was married to John Adams in the front living room. House is still there. You've probably all driven by it. Feel free to stop in anytime. We're open again after COVID, and we're starting a few programs this spring. But that's where she spent, obviously, a lot of her time. So her father had a library. Her grandfather, John Quincy, arguably the most influential politician in all of Braintree. He lived in Mount Wollaston, the North Precinct of Braintree. He was one of the wealthiest people in Braintree. Everyone knew him. He was also involved in legislative matters, involved in the militia, highly respected, very wealthy. They had the nicest house in Wollaston. The city of Quincy was named after him in 1792. So Quincy was named after Abigail Adams' grandfather, John Quincy. Her grandmother, I would like to have met. Her name was Elizabeth. By all accounts, she was a character. I shouldn't say that. That can be a demeaning word. She was independent and opinionated, and she wasn't afraid to speak her mind. And she told Abigail not to be afraid to speak her mind. And she helped Abigail with her readings. She introduced her to a lot of the books in John Quincy's library. Elizabeth was well read. And it might have been one of the reasons for John Quincy's success is that he had a strong wife behind him. Everyone seems to have loved this woman. She, again, even though she spoke her mind, I think people like people who speak their minds. And she certainly did. So her name was Elizabeth Norton, and she married John Quincy. So she would be a very important person in Abigail's life. This very outgoing personality, just like Abigail. Abigail was very outgoing. Abigail's mother was not. Abigail's mother was very quiet. Her name was also Elizabeth. A very good woman by all accounts, very charitable. She was constantly paying visits to people to minister to the sick. She ended up dying ministering to the sick. She contracted smallpox, I think in her early 50s. But she was always out doing good work in the parish. Abigail inherited that from her mother. She did a lot of good work for people, and this is what most people don't know about. Abigail will talk about her financial prowess and how she started her own business during the Revolutionary War. But she gave a lot of her money to women who were in trouble, women whose husbands had passed away. She called them her pensioners, and she was determined when they needed help, they should come and talk to her. She had a lot of devoted friends, as you can imagine. When Abigail later went to Europe to go with John in 1784 with her daughter Nabby, dozens of people saw her off, and they walked her to the pier, and they're all crying. And she directed her uncle, Cotton Tufts, who was also a very important figure in Abigail's life. She would be his agent. He would make the payments to the pensioners to make sure they were taken care of in her absence. She had the list. She knew who needed help. Later, when Abigail passed away, she took care of many people after she passed, and she left a will, which in those days women didn't do. Her husband was very much alive. The will itself had no legal value at all. The father, the husband, had complete control over the couple's property, real estate and personal property. Only he could decide what could happen to that property. She didn't think twice about it. She wrote the will. And I'm guessing it was probably because she realized that her husband would abide by it. You know, he probably said, yeah, of course. But she often referred to her money. Very few women referred to their money. It was the husband's money. But for her, she took a great deal of pride in how she managed to make money at a time when John was not able to make much money, and he was never very good with money. He was never a very good investor. She was much better than he was. And she studied at it. She worked at it. She was advised by Cotton Tufts, her uncle, and others. But going back to these early days in their first meeting, I want to mention this quickly. John Adams went with his friend Richard Cranch to the parsonage in 1759. Abigail was only 15 years old at the time. She was born in 44. So she was 15, he was 24, about a 9-year difference when they first met. Cranch was there to visit the older sister Mary. John Adams was not impressed with them. They weren't impressed with him. He noted in his diary, and he said that they weren't delicate or they weren't candid. He used several words to describe their comments to him, and he didn't appreciate. Apparently, they had suggested that he was a bit pompous, that he had airs or put on airs, and you can almost picture the two of them giving it to him, giving him the business. And he was very, he might have been full of himself, and he went home very self-conscious, maybe insecure, who knows. And apparently it didn't go very well. So in his diary, he did not have any compliments for Mary, for Abigail, or for Parson William Smith. Yet, within 2 years, John Adams and Abigail began a correspondence. He quickly realized that this young lady is incredibly smart, and he appreciated her intelligence and her candor. And again, I suspect, I don't know, I suspect it's because she gave it right back to him. Perhaps he could not have ended up with a woman who was subservient or just it didn't challenge him. She challenged John all the time. And you read the letters, you really get a sense of her sense of humor, his sense of humor, and they talked about everything. Again, at a time when women had no legal rights, she wouldn't hesitate to push back, saying, this doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't make sense. They talked about William, her brother Billy, and she said, why should children in the same family be thus distinguished? Why should young men be educated and young women not? Years later, her niece, Mary Cranch's daughter, loved math and science. She wanted to study math and science. Instead, her brothers were able to go to school and study math and science, and they didn't like math and science. And she was frustrated. And Abigail wrote to her, explaining how this is unfair and that maybe at some point in the future But she encouraged her, and she encouraged her to do reading and to study the subjects anyway. Abigail would study several different subjects herself. She would attend science lectures in Boston and in London and in Paris, in addition to the theater and the opera. I'll talk about her experience over there in just a bit. But that first meeting in 1759 did not go well. By 1761, they were dating. In 1764, they were married. Parson Smith and his wife did not like the match. They thought John Adams was below them. They wanted their daughter to marry up, not marry down. He was just a country lawyer from Braintree, they said, who still reeked of the farm. A little condescending, a little insulting. But Abigail clearly saw something in John that they didn't. And they continued to write, and they continued to get closer, and ultimately they were married in 64. Again, they were married in the front room in the parsonage. I don't know how well John Adams and the parson got along. Looking at some of the letters, I don't think they got along too well. And Abigail's mother was very strict. One of the reasons Abigail was never sent to a woman's academy to be educated, they said it was her poor health. They said, "You're a very weak child. We don't want to stress your health." Abigail was convinced pretty early on, though, that it was because she was a woman. And it always bothered her throughout her life. That was the one subject that she always came back to: women's education, women's education, women's education. During the Revolution, after the Revolution, with her grandchildren, her granddaughters, she would always come back to that theme. And there's some wonderful quotes on that. But they were married. They ultimately had 6 children. I'm just going through some of the statistics here, but I think it's important to look at the larger picture. So they're married in 1764 after John was inoculated for smallpox. Inoculation was still a thing. It was still being debated. The progressive-minded people said, "No, this is science." Sound familiar? Science encourages you to do this. John Adams did. He was inoculated, went into Boston. He was isolated, quarantined for several days, a few weeks, I believe. And Abigail wanted to be inoculated as well. Her parents said, "Absolutely not." This is just before they were married. Just before they were married. They said, "Absolutely not. That's not for women." And that bothered her. Ultimately, she would become inoculated. She'd have all of her children inoculated several years later when John was away. She took that step by herself as well. But I think she understood that he would have approved it as well. Always interested in science, always interested in progress. And she made a quote talking about John and how he was, people said how courageous he was and how courageous all these people were, all these men who were being inoculated. She said, "Why is courage seen as a virtue in men but not women? Why weren't women seen as courageous when they were?" That bothered her as well. So she's constantly expressing these feelings in her letters. They ultimately settled at the foot of Pence Hill, as we all know. John's mother, Susanna, lived in the house right next door. 6 children they ultimately had. Abigail Jr. was the first child. Nabby, they would call her. She died of breast cancer in her 40s. I believe she was in her 40s. After 3 years of terrible pain. Nabby and Abigail were incredibly close. The only daughter who survived to adulthood. She spent so much time with Nabby in Braintree, then over in Europe. They were best friends. And when Nabby contracted breast cancer, it was incredibly difficult. By then, Abigail's health wasn't that good. It was in 1813. Abigail died 5 years later. But she had surgery to remove the cancer without any type of Novocaine or pain medication. I cannot imagine that. They've described the procedure. It sounded horrific. And the fact that she was subjected to this, it obviously bothered Abigail and others very much. But Nabby was the oldest child. John Quincy Adams was born a few years later in 1767. Susanna, or Suki they called her, was born the next year. She died at only 2 years old. She would have been the second daughter, but she only lived to her second birthday. And then 2 boys, Charles and Thomas, and then finally a girl, Elizabeth, was stillborn. So they just had the one daughter, Nabby, and 3 sons. John Quincy, the oldest boy, Johnny, would be the most successful, as we all know. John Adams was second president of the United States. John Quincy Adams was the sixth president of the United States. So Abigail was the wife of one president and the mother of another. Only Barbara Bush, I think, can claim that. She can claim that as well. But again, I think Abigail's influence on both is understated. Certainly John Quincy, who spent a lot of his time as a small boy with his mother. During the war, when formal education wasn't as available, she taught all of the kids at home. Normally it was the father's decision as to what to do with the children and educating them. She took an active role in that, then and later. She did not hesitate to express her opinions to John, who was ready for this or who was ready for that, what subjects they should be studying. Girls should not study certain subjects. Abigail said, yes, they should. So she would encourage Nabby to study other subjects. Nabby, by all accounts, wasn't interested in those subjects, but Abigail was always encouraging her to expand and try different things. The family would move several times, always coming back to the farm in Braintree, particularly in the 1760s and into the 1770s. 1768, that's when he first moved to Boston. That's when he was elected to as a state representative. He had been offered a job as a selectman again in Braintree. He turned it down. The family moved to Boston to be closer to, he opened up a law office there as well. He did well. Eventually they would move back to Braintree and then back to Boston a few times. He would always keep an office open in Boston. In 1770, when the Boston Massacre took place, the Adamses were right around the corner. They heard the shots. Abigail heard the shots of the Boston Massacre. John Adams ran out immediately to find out what was happening. That was clearly a defining moment in the lives of everyone. We all know that John Adams played a major role in the trial after the Boston Massacre. He mentioned at the time that if these poor tools, meaning the British soldiers, who opened fire on the crowd, if they should be prosecuted for any of their illegal conduct, they must be punished. If, however, the soldiers in self-defense should kill any of them, they must be tried, and if truth was respected and the law prevailed, they must be acquitted. He surprised everyone by taking on the defense himself. A lot of people were angry with him, including his cousin Sam, but others only respected him more. Adams was basically arguing, we're not the rebels here. We're not the people who are violating the law. We believe in the law, and we're going to try these soldiers according to the law. If they're guilty, they'll be punished. If not, they'll be freed. And he would take that position throughout the Revolution. We're not the ones who were pushing back. We're not the ones who are violating principle and law. The Crown is, Parliament is, not us. We value the law and we abide by the law. And it convinced the British, and this is what he hoped, that it was convincing the British that it wasn't simply dealing with a mob, but with a dedicated, thoughtful people who were committed to the rule of law. Abigail Adams supported that decision 100% to defend those soldiers. Later, when the war started, everything changed. Adams, after the coercive acts were passed in 1774, after the Boston Tea Party, he would go to Philadelphia. This is when the separation started. They had been separated before. John was a lawyer. He traveled the circuit around the state, went up to the District of Maine, which was then part of Massachusetts. So he'd often be writing letters back and forth. She'd write to him, he'd write to her. Now, suddenly, he's going pretty far away. He's not out in Worcester anymore. He's down in Philadelphia, very far away from her, very far away from this growing family, which is incredibly difficult for Abigail. She would be responsible for running the entire farm on her own. She would be in charge of the hired help. They did have hired help, at least in the first few years of the war. Eventually, it was impossible to get any hired help. And John wasn't much help in terms of what she should do. He was explaining how much the farm should be making, how much it should be generating. And she's like, there's no one here to help. He said, do what you can. And she did. And she made some decisions. She ultimately got involved in sharecropping, right? A practice that became popular in the South. She would, instead of having workers come in, there weren't any workers. So she would bring in tenants, and they would work the farm, and they would share the profits. And it worked out pretty well, and it took some of the pressure off of her. just referring to the woman's rights, some of the quotes in these letters were just remarkable. One of the comments she made during the war, and this is in the months leading up to the Declaration of Independence in 1776. She said, "Women should not submit to laws that are not made in their interest." That's pretty revolutionary. "Nor should they be content with the simple role of being companions to their husbands. They should educate themselves and thus be recognized for intellectual capabilities." And then in March of 1776, she wrote that famous letter. Before the Declaration of Independence was signed, John was obviously writing to her, telling her what was happening, and she gave her advice constantly. And she would advise him on how to conduct himself. She'd tell him that you're coming across all wrong. People don't like you. You need to do this or you need to do that. And he, by all accounts, listened to her. And she's talked in this letter, the famous, "Remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors were. Do not put unlimited power into the hands of the husbands." Again, I'm sure she's remembering back to her childhood and her brother William and Billy, who got all of these advantages, and she and her sisters did not. She said, "Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." Was it tongue-in-cheek? Probably a little bit, but she was also making her point, and she was absolutely correct. And John appreciated that. He could kid with her, but at the same time, he appreciated her candor and her honesty. And she was talking about heroes. He had mentioned in a letter, talking about heroes and statesmen and philosophers were debating these issues. She said, "If we mean to have heroes, statesmen, and philosophers, we should have learned women as well." She's always coming back to it, always coming back to it. And she would later say to him, in one of the letters, she said that she was happy to be married to a man who didn't ridicule women's education. So he would constantly support her comments. He would often agree with her. They often disagreed, there's no question about that. They were both very much products of their time, but to be sure, he certainly agreed. And to one of the issues, talking about the importance of the first impressions on babies, and how they're the most important, she said, "Well, you always say that the first impressions are the most important, the most durable." She said, "Then surely it's of great importance that those who are to instill those first principles, the mothers, should be suitably qualified for the trust." She said, "They should be educated. Who better to nurture these children than educated women? And it would make them better spouses on top of that." She asked her cousin Thayer, I think it was John, I could be wrong on his first name. Her cousin, Thayer, was the only male in her group of correspondence when she was a young girl. She corresponded with a number of young women. They read books together. They shared impressions of those books. It opened her eyes to a lot of different things. Interestingly, it was Richard Cranch who introduced her to the proper books, she said. She introduced him to philosophy, to poetry. She appreciated Milton and Pope and Shakespeare, all because of Richard Cranch, the man who would later marry her sister Mary. So all of these people played important roles in her life, but Thayer was the only young man in her group, and that was permissible because he was a cousin. If he wasn't a cousin, it wouldn't have been appropriate. But since it was a cousin, then he could be part of the group as well. And all the young women liked him, and they could talk with him, and he could talk with them. And she said, "Why should your sex," to Thayer, "wish for such a disparity in those whom they one day intend for companions and associates?" So she discussed this issue with all of her correspondents, both male and female. I don't want to dominate this. I want to give people a chance to talk, but I do want to mention that during the war, inflation went up dramatically, taxation went up dramatically. As a result, there wasn't much money around, and there weren't many goods to buy. And she came up with an idea. She said, "Maybe I can sell things." John Adams at this point was in Europe, and she suggested to him, "Perhaps you can send me some goods from Europe. You can get them cheaper, send them in a trunk, and when I get them, I can sell them here. I can parcel them out." It wouldn't be appropriate for her to directly sell these items, but she could act as like a middle person. A lot of the shopkeepers' shelves were empty. Abigail could perhaps provide handkerchiefs and linens and other things to sell, and she could make a tidy profit. And sure enough, she did. They later figured out that even if 2/3 of all of the goods were lost at sea, if privateers took the goods, if only 1/3 of them would make it, he would send different shipments she would make a good profit. So this was a very lucrative arrangement. And he would send these trunks. In those days, the privateers, if they captured a ship, they would allow the captain, the crew, and people on board the ship to keep their private property, and they'd take everything else. So John Adams would always put family necessaries on the trunk so that they wouldn't touch it. They said, okay, family necessaries, we won't touch that. So most of Abigail's gifts or supplies made it to the United States. And then he figured, you know what, I'm going to start spreading this thing out. Anyone who left Europe to come back to America, John Adams would always go to them and say, look, could you bring back this gift for Abigail? Always a gift for Abigail. It'd be a big box. One of the couriers was none other than Lafayette, the Marquis de Lafayette. He was a courier carrying a box for Abigail. So when he came and he gave it to Abigail, and she'd open it up and she would sell these items. Brilliant move. And it enabled her to save money. And again, she wouldn't just use that money to buy frivolous things. Actually, there weren't many frivolous things to buy, but she would provide help and assistance to the people who needed it. And she also started investing in land. John Adams liked to invest in land. He's the first one to say, why don't you buy that parcel in Haverhill or that parcel over here? She was eyeing this project in Vermont that just become a state. So she started dabbling in real estate with the help of her uncle, Cotton Tufts, again. He would be the one who would actually have to transact the business because only a man could do it. Abigail would go through him, a very trusted individual. Later, she would begin investing in state securities, bonds. Massachusetts bonds, but also federal government bonds, United States bonds. Brilliant move. She became a speculator. This type of activity would be frowned upon by many. A lot of these bonds or certificates were given to soldiers as payment for their service. And they would unload these certificates for pennies on the dollar just to make some cash. And for people with cash, they would pay 10 cents, 20 cents, 30 cents on the dollar, and they would have a bond with a face value of, just say $10. And they hopefully at some point in the future would cash that in for $10, even though they paid a fraction of that. So she began to invest in securities, both state and federal. Any money that she would make, she would invest in securities. John disagreed. He thought she should invest more in land. He directed Cotton Tufts to buy a piece of land. She sent a letter to Cotton Tufts saying, no, let's not buy that land. And poor Cotton Tufts was in the middle. He was designated as the agent for John Adams when Abigail went to Paris and England. So she was with John in Europe, and poor Cotton Tufts is the agent for John Adams, and he's getting dueling letters. He's saying one thing, she's saying another. He tended to agree with Abigail most of the time, but he was caught in the middle. Ultimately, John would usually come around to her way of thinking. He would agree that buying these bonds was probably a good thing. It was a good way to hedge the bet. Again, with taxation up, with inflation up, the best way to protect your money is to perhaps invest in these bonds. And later, when the United States government was created, the new government in 1787, Alexander Hamilton, of course, recommended that all bonds be paid in full and that the federal government should assume all state debts. Big deal. He insisted that American credit needed to be good. If you issue bonds, you pay those bonds. If any interest needs to be paid, you pay that interest. Abigail agreed. She agreed, absolutely. These things should be paid in full. Many people did not know how many securities Abigail had, but she was confident. She was buying those securities right up until the end. Cotton Tufts at one point said, hey, I think we should unload these. She said, no. And she said, in fact, buy more. Okay, and they continued to buy more. Ultimately, the Assumption Bill was passed after the government started, and she received a windfall for those investments during the war. She stopped her small business, but she had made quite a bit of money. And again, she referred to it as her money, but it was important to her. It was always important to her to have a place of her own. A book, a room of one's own, how important that is. She talked about that long before it became a thing. When she moved to Paris, she was amazed at the house that they were able to afford. She had a wing to herself with servants, never very comfortable. Went to Britain, smaller house, but still quite impressive. When they ended up coming back to Braintree, she couldn't possibly move into that old salt box anymore. And they ended up buying that house, which they called Peacefield, which required quite a bit of work. But she agreed that that was a piece of real estate that she could agree with John on. They needed that. They kept the farm. Ultimately, it would pass to other members of the family. But it's remarkable that that old farm at the foot of Penn's Hill, several dozen acres of land, they worked that land. They had people who worked that land for years. Now, of course, you wouldn't reckon that the MBTA runs right through where their fields are. The funeral home right there would have been Abigail's garden. Yeah. That's where she gardened herself. Remarkable, really, when you think about it. But Abigail was far ahead of her time with the education of her children. Yes, question, thank you.
Is only one of those houses originally from that spot?
No, they were both there.
I thought one was moved.
I always thought that too, but no, they were both built there. Does anyone disagree? I think they were both built there. Yeah. They're interesting houses. Yeah.
Could you say something a little bit about Josiah Quincy Jr.? Because he gets glossed over a lot. He's someone that needs to be upset because he was the one who was designated by the British militia to represent them at the time of what's become known as the Boston Massacre. He invited John Adams in.
This is good. I didn't know. Yeah. I knew he was involved, but I didn't realize that was the...
He was. And as Josiah was arguing the case, John
right.
Adams was open to don't implicate the people of Boston. So he kind of stepped on this a bit. But Josiah Quincy had consumption. And he was advised to go south to the warmer weather.
Afterwards.
What he did, he went to all of the governors and governments of all the colonies right down the line to learn what they were about. And then decided, well, we could take this show over to England because he represented the British and that they would welcome him. So he did go over and talk to all the people that he could.
Right.
In Parliament, he was there for better part of the year. They voted him down when it came up for a vote.
See, I did not know this. Thank you.
He came back on the boat and he died as the boat was coming into Boston Harbor.
No kidding.
And he had a lot of things that he wanted to share. But nonetheless, he's buried at the Hancock Cemetery. There's a wonderful monument to him that's sort of mounded up.
There have been one good book that I know of that was written on his life. I haven't read it, but I will now. Right.
Then there were like four
of them. Yes.
They were all mayors of Boston.
Correct.
Quincy Markham is named after the second.
Oh, the second one. Okay. Yes, I didn't know that. It's remarkable when you think of the stories. I did a paper years ago on the Loyalists of Boston. Yeah. Most of the people who were making good money, the merchants of Boston, the last thing they wanted was a war. They were doing pretty well. Roe himself, Roe's Wharf, he was a loyalist. There were several who were frustrated. They were frustrated with Sam Adams and all of these troublemaking patriots. So reading how they interacted, the tug of war that was going on, you really had to walk that fine line, those loyalists.
Another little piece on the character of John Adams has been he and Jonathan Sewell part of it. And that was very painful for both of them because they both grew up each other.
Yeah.
They grew up together, they were best friends.
I think Dave McCullough does a good job of talking about that relationship. And that's one thing you don't realize. And traveling at that time was incredibly difficult. And they were traveling companions a lot as well. And just moving from Braintree down to Philadelphia.
Smith goes into that a lot, I don't know.
Okay. Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah, he goes into that. He does a deep dive into that.
That's what I mean. So many of these stories are out there. It's just a matter of finding the sources and talking. We're all taught the same things in school. Same things.
Josiah Quincy Jr. really deserves to be.
Well, then we're going to have to devote a night to him and talk about him. And you'll have to come and you're going to have to participate.
Historian Quincy, you can. She's on YouTube and she's been a lecture on Josiah Quincy because she feels that he's really been pushed to one side.
Oh, we'll have to invite her over then, for sure. Yeah. Oh, that sounds good. But as far as Abigail is concerned, again, we talk about her as First Lady, her relationship with African Americans. She was opposed to slavery. Her parents owned 4 slaves. Phoebe, the most famous one, helped raise Abigail, very close to Abigail. John Adams was always opposed to it. The Adams family never believed in slavery. As a married woman, she was opposed to slavery. Yet you read some of the letters. She was certainly a product of her time. Her correspondence with her sister, Mary Cranch. Phoebe after she was freed by Parson Smith, became a paid servant of Abigail and John. And when Abigail went to Europe, she couldn't find a suitable tenant to live in the salt box at the bottom of Penn's Hill, so she asked Phoebe, who had just got remarried, to live in the house rent-free. Yet Mary, her sister, and Cotton Tufts would often go to check on things, make sure she's taking care of the house.
Phoebe would let everyone in.
She did. And she let some homeless people in, homeless African, or Negroes, as she referred to them, because they had no place to go for a few nights. And Cotton Tufts and Mary Cranch told her, don't do that. She continued to do it. So Phoebe did her own thing. And Phoebe and her husband would often go to different events and she'd get dressed up. And Mary would sometimes make some condescending remark and refer to them as their sable servant. They would make fun of the way she dressed and the way her husband carried himself, another black man. So there was this benign racism, I think that's a term they often use. She was opposed to slavery, but she clearly reflected the bigotry and the racism of her time. Oh, sure.
Abington, I think, is probably one of the places where there were more slaves than anywhere.
Yeah, and that's fascinating because most people don't realize that slavery existed in the North. Well, it did. Not to the same extent, of course, because we didn't have the plantation system.
An enslaved person is an enslaved person.
Yeah, absolutely. But reading about Phoebe, there have been a few books written about her and her experience, but her and Abigail were incredibly close. And she was one of Abigail's pensioners for many years. So that relationship was incredibly important. I've been talking for, yes?
John, you described how John Adams was away much of the time to London, to Europe, to Philadelphia, and that Abigail was pretty much left on her own to take care of the...
The library will be closing in 30 minutes. Library closing procedures will begin at 8:45. The copy and computers will be shut down shortly. The lower level and the upper level will be process of closing, and the building must be gated by 8:55 for staff to clear the building. Please plan your time accordingly.
You got a few minutes left.
Hint, hint, hint. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. Does anyone else have any comments or questions? I mean, there's some food up here, so maybe... Yeah.
If you could just describe briefly, a little bit more detail, if you can, about how Abigail managed the home when John was away all that time. You mentioned the sharecroppers were working the land. You mentioned how she was making some money from the investments. But as far as just some of the routine day-to-day activities, like something as simple as how do you get water? How do you have to do repairs on the house maintenance?
She did certain things herself, but they always had two servants, usually two young women in the house. They always did. They always had those two servants. But Abigail would perform the same function. She would obviously do cooking. She wouldn't do some of the more difficult work. Some of the younger girls would do that. They'd always have field hands if they could afford them. Again, but as the war went on, it became incredibly expensive. They were getting inducements to join the Continental Army, so there were no people to be had. And she was, racking her brain to try to get someone to do it. She'd hire someone for a week and they'd leave. She'd hire someone else for a week, they'd leave. It was incredibly frustrating for her, and it bothered her that John didn't seem to mind that much. He's just sending these short letters, and she's saying, hey, just to let you know, this is what I'm dealing with here. And when the war started, she could hear right, as we all know, that house is right on top of the street. It was then too. She could look out and she could see people walking by. When John was there, he always left the window open, and she said people would just walk by, and she was always afraid people would look in while they're sleeping. So it was pretty close to the road even then. But she was actively involved in everything, everything.
I know they had crops to supply some of their food, but how about meat? Was there hunting of deer or turkeys? How did they get other types of food? Do we know?
I don't think she did it. He did small hunting, but I don't think John Adams was a hunter by any stretch. And he would acquire from other people in the town. Again, bartering was, I think, quite common. And there were neighbors that he was very close with. One of the neighbors, the Wheezies or the Beesies next door, they were selling their farm, and John wanted to buy it. And Abigail's like, I don't think so. She said, we've got enough poor land. We don't need any more. She said, let's put that money in bonds. And he would eventually go, all right, fine, whatever you think is best. So they had that relationship. So John would defer to her on a number of things. There were other things I wanted to comment on, but please feel free to come up. We can talk about it. And thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.